Europe is executing the most ambitious regulatory and economic realignment in peacetime history. The Green Deal is designed to completely decarbonize an entire continental economy. This chart plots EU greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. On a macroeconomic level, emissions dropped by a massive 37%. But mapping social reality on this second axis reveals a different picture. Citizens unable to heat their homes jump to 10.6%. The laws of atmospheric physics respond predictably to aggregate emission cuts, but the friction of household cash flows and the inertia of legacy building stock operate on an entirely different clock. We are past the point of debating the climate science. The required audit now is one of distributional honesty, tracking exactly who bears the financial weight of these policies. When we run the numbers down to the household level, the EU's climate architecture imposes structurally regressive costs on vulnerable demographics. It is a transition modeled perfectly for a spreadsheet, failing at the kitchen table. To understand why this divergence is happening, we need to trace macro policy directives down to the ultimate microeconomic unit, the household balance sheet. The primary driver of rising costs is a mechanism called ETS2. This policy extends carbon pricing directly to the combustion fuels used in residential buildings and road transport. Analysts project this carbon penalty will add up to 50 cents per liter to the cost of traditional heating fuels. Scaled across the continent, high carbon prices under ETS2 are projected to extract €1,112 billion from EU households cumulatively by 2040. For a low-income family monitoring their winter usage, the red dials on a domestic gas meter represent an inelastic, unavoidable expense. Recent input-output modeling demonstrates that single-person and childless households are already altering baseline survival behaviors, systematically reducing their food budgets just to afford winter heating. Because heating is a biological necessity, ETS2 acts as a highly regressive tax. It extracts the largest proportional share of income from those with the least financial flexibility. The legislative solution designed to offset these rising heating costs is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. The directive mandates that residential building stocks reduce their average primary energy use by 16% by 2030. Achieving this requires massive structural upgrades to millions of properties. The physical reality is that nearly half of European housing stock was constructed before 1980. It is thermally inefficient and requires highly invasive, expensive retrofitting. This creates a localized economic paradox. ETS2 carbon pricing drastically inflates your baseline heating costs. Escaping those recurring carbon penalties requires executing the deep retrofits demanded by the Buildings Directive, which demands massive upfront capital. But households spending over 40% of their disposable income on housing and energy do not have capital. This financial wall traps the household in a deteriorating building, forcing them to pay the maximum carbon penalty indefinitely. Without targeted, immediate subsidies, mandated capital upgrades function as a punitive tax on demographics too poor to modernize their own living conditions. The second pillar of the carbon pricing mechanism targets road transport and commuter mobility. The policy objective is a complete transition to electric vehicles. While the total cost of ownership is improving, the upfront purchase premium for an EV remains mathematically out of reach for lower-income buyers. This barrier has generated a new vulnerability metric for the European Commission: transport poverty. It must now be assessed directly alongside energy poverty. The deployment of green transit infrastructure is densely concentrated in wealthy urban centers. In the rural periphery, populations lack public transit alternatives and cannot afford electric vehicles. They remain dependent on traditional combustion engines to participate economically. This creates a rural double-bind. Geographically immobilized populations become captive payers of the new carbon premium on fuel. Heavily subsidizing a green transition they are locked out of participating in. Beyond heating and transport, the transition policies exert severe pressure on the final essential line item in the household ledger, the food budget. The farm-to-fork strategy is designed to drastically cut domestic pesticide and fertilizer use. Economic models project this could shrink total European agricultural output by up to 12%. This supply-side reduction is amplified by the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, which entered its operational phase in 2026. This mechanism applies a mandatory carbon tariff to essential imports at the EU border, specifically targeting non-EU fertilizers. That tariff cascades downward through the supply chain, creating permanent structural upward pressure on the operating costs of European farms. The resulting compound pressure from reduced domestic yields and higher imported fertilizer costs points to a projected 17% rise in domestic food prices at the retail level. Layering these supply-side restrictions on climate-driven demand shocks brutally compresses the budgets of the bottom income quintile, a strain manifesting most acutely across Eastern Europe. The European Union acknowledges these regressive impacts. To offset them, they built a compensatory tool, the Social Climate Fund. But when we weigh those projected household carbon costs against the budget meant to protect them, the math fails. The fund provides 86.7 billion euros. That covers roughly 8% of the projected ETS2 burden. The mechanism is mathematically incapable of shielding the vulnerable population. Furthermore, institutional lethargy has severely delayed national distribution plans. Households are forced to absorb real-time price shocks long before the subsidies activate. This reveals a systemic blind spot in modern finance. Environmental, social, and governance frameworks hyper-focus on environmental taxonomies, but lack the standardized metrics to measure this specific social fallout. Capital allocation strictly follows the environmental signal. As a result, the macro system rewards pristine ESG ratings while quietly institutionalizing household poverty in the background. If we step back from the household ledger, we can map exactly where these economic pressures pool across the continent. The Energy Poverty Advisory Hub's statistical models prove that vulnerability to green policies follows a specific geographic and structural logic. The most acute vulnerability zone is Southern Europe, caught in a severe feedback loop of extreme heat stress, poor building thermal performance, and high baseline poverty. In Eastern and Northern Europe, harsh winters collide dangerously with a heavy, entrenched reliance on legacy fossil fuel heating infrastructure, making carbon penalties unavoidable. And in Western Europe, the highest aggregate carbon prices are creating a severe capital squeeze on the middle class, pushing them just above subsidy thresholds, but leaving them unable to afford rapid adaptation. Applying uniform continental regulations to these heterogeneous economies causes the costs of transition to land with stark geographic disparity. We do not need to wait for 2040 to see this mathematical stress fracture the system. It is already breaking out into the real world. Across 2025 and 2026, we saw aggressive policy rollbacks, the delay of the ETS2 carbon market, the softening of automotive emission standards, and the total abandonment of pesticide regulations in the farm-to-fork strategy. These political reversals serve as a violent market signal. The unmanaged social costs of these policies have breached the limits of public tolerance. Once a policy loses the consent of the governed, no amount of institutional ambition can force its completion. Political legitimacy is the ultimate binding constraint of climate policy. If the social realities of the transition continue to be ignored, a socially inadequate green transition will prove to be environmentally impossible.